Next lecture in memory of Shapurji Saklatvala. Shapurji Saklatvala was a British politician of Indian Parsi heritage. In 1922, Saklatvala became the third ethnic Indian elected to the Parliament of the United Kingdom. He also was among the few members of the Communist Party of Great Britain to serve as a Member of Parliament. Born in 1874 in Bombay, a committed socialist, he ultimately joined the new Communist Party of Great Britain. This lecture is titled Ancient Indian Dialects and Marx and delivered by Professor Shannon Brincat, Senior Lecturer, University of the Sunshine Coast, Australia. Professor, can I please request you to come on stage? This session will be chaired by Professor Ramaa Vasudevan. Ramaa Vasudevan is an associate professor at the Department of Economics, Colorado State University. She's an associate editor of Review of Political Economy and a member of the editorial board of the Review of Radical Political Economics. Professor Vasudevan, I request you to come on stage and take over the proceedings.
So, welcome to the Shapurji Saklatvala lecture. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Shannon Brincat, Senior Lecturer in Politics from University of Sunshine Coast, Australia. Shannon's work is pretty diverse, everything from tyrannicide to climate justice, international relations. But what he's going to be talking about is basically the ancient Indian dialectics and Marx. So I look forward to this, and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, I hope. So, please.
We're just trying to find the presentation. Come on.
It's not showing up?
No, it looks like it's just us.
Okay. So, yeah, it's on.
Okay, so,
No.
let's check that. Oh,
Better. Much better.
okay.
So, welcome to the Shapurji Saklatvala lecture. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Shannon Brincat, Senior Lecturer in Politics from University of Sunshine Coast, Australia. Shannon's work is pretty diverse, everything from tyrannicide to climate justice, international relations. But what he's going to be talking about is basically the ancient Indian dialectics and Marx. So I look forward to this, and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, I hope. So, please.
Shapurji was one of the few members of the Communist Party of Great Britain to serve in the British Parliament, a champion of the League Against Imperialism and a leader of the 1926 General Strike. So it's a tremendous honour to give this lecture in his name. So good afternoon, and thanks for coming to this talk. I'm Shannon Brincat from the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I'd like to thank our chair, but also the conference organisers for having me here. It's been exceptionally well organised, and I think it's a great tribute to Marx's legacy and really gives me optimism for the future. So today I'll be presenting a chapter on my new book. The chapter's called Ancient Indian Dialectics, and it's the opening chapter of Volume 1. The book's called The Spiral World, which I hope will come out sometime next year. And it basically looks at how dialectics and dialectical thinking has developed in what's called the Axial Age, and I'll go into what I mean by that very soon. So I must confess to be giving this talk quite nervously in front of this audience. So I'm hoping to get some great feedback from you and comments. All right, so the structure. If we can move the slides. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So the structure of today's talk, I'll basically go through 20 minutes and an introduction to the book, without which we won't really understand what the chapter's all about, and then another 20 minutes where I'll go through some of the key findings about Axial Age Indian thought on dialectics. So we'll hopefully have some little time for questions. So the aims of the book are basically to reinvigorate dialectical thinking. And there's three sort of assumptions that go into how I define dialectics. Firstly, that the world and everything in it undergoes constant change, so that's the doctrine of flux. Secondly, that everything in the cosmos is inherently related, however closely or distant that relation might be, and that's the idea of interconnection or the philosophy of internal relations. And thirdly, that these processes, these relations of change between all things are what we observe and experience as humans in the phenomenal world. And so these three things I'll outline in a little more detail shortly. So one of the key corrections that I'll try to make when I talk about dialectics is to really clarify and move beyond this idea that dialectics is this thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel never said that. He called that a wooden structure. And rejected it. The only reason he carried forward was his biographer didn't really understand the logic, and he reverted back to that description. And similarly, Marx too called it a lifeless schema. So it might be a good way to begin to understand dialectics, but certainly I want to move away from that in my talk. So the real reason behind why I'm exploring dialectics in this historical sense is to help us to understand change in the world, the relations of interdependency, and internal relations. So Marx's purpose, if not his actual vision, is very much at the forefront of this work. And it's my firm belief that dialectics is one of the best ways for us to understand political and social change, and that's because it's the only one that takes this ontology as the basis of its method. And this is why it was so fundamental to Marx's thought, of course, and why I think it has to remain central to any critical theory of society today. So with this hope in mind of reinvigorating dialectics, what I actually try to do is delve into these ancient forms of dialectical thinking, millennia before Marx, and mostly from non-Western traditions as well, so including the Vedic, Buddhist, Taoist, Greek, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Islamic and scholastic thought, with the hope that we can reclaim some of these elements of dialectical thinking that might have been lost to history along the way and how they might illuminate social problems today. So we can look at dialectics in any number of ways. Firstly, we could define it by how key thinkers have come up with meanings behind dialectics, so i.e. Marx's dialectic or the Hegelian system and so on. And whilst there's much to say about how these towering figures did advance dialectics in crucial ways, they obviously don't cover the whole, and they also have their own limitations as well. The other way we could look at it is by looking at particular schools of thought, so Taoist dialectics or dialectical materialism, but that only broadens out the circle by a little bit in degree. The third option, and what I've sort of tried to undertake in the volume, is to define dialectics by its constitutive elements, so its logical form, its method, and its ontology, and from these elements we can then define dialectics and see how it's been composed across human thought over time, so how it's expanded in certain periods and how it's contracted. And using this constitutive method, we can do at least four things. We can trace, compare, evaluate, and reconstruct. So it allows us to historically trace how dialectics has emerged to what it is today and what has been lost along the way. It allows us to compare various forms of dialectical thinking between schools and movements and individual thinkers. Thirdly, it offers a way to evaluate different dialectical forms, but what they either emphasize or tend to leave out. And fourthly, as part of tracing, comparison, and evaluation, it allows us to actually take up a reconstruction. And my hope is that it will provide the grounds for a more comprehensive notion of dialectics, one that's a lot more inclusionary and holistic, and that can emerge from history and from these different cultures. This is what my friend Professor Lily Ling calls this worlding dialectics. And so hopefully we can end up with a stronger and more robust dialectical method moving forward. So I don't know if you can see that, but that's just the structure of the two volumes, and what I'll be presenting today is Chapter 1. So in this first volume I trace dialectical thinking before it was understood by Hegel and mastered by Marx. And I trace dialectics through this period of what Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age. And I show that dialectical thinking is seemingly universal in its formation. I show how it emerges across a variety of cultures independently of each other, and though there is a lot of speculation on the degree of contact between these civilizations, that's a matter for historians and archaeologists to determine. And through this I really want to move beyond those tropes that reduce dialectics to either Western patterns of thought and Eurocentric claims of philosophy. So I'm more interested in reconstructing these different dialectical systems and to find out what we can use of them for today. And of course I've found quite a lot. I'm critical of these systems, but in a way that's more reconstructive. So I'm more interested at bringing things together, or a synthesis, if we want to revert back to that term, rather than division. So creating a conversation between dialectical systems. Okay, so what is dialectics? It means many different things to many different peoples, but consistent across most forms, if not all of them, is the ontology of flux and relations, methods of dialogue and logic, and a purpose or interest in the possibility of consciously directing change. But it's important to realize dialectics is not a theory, and it doesn't do anything of its own. It's no magic bullet. I think it's best conceived as a way of thinking, or how I term it in the book, as an approach to thinking thought itself. Okay, so it's thinking on thinking. And what it helps us do is to bring in a wider set of relations between things, and therefore a wider net of the possibilities for change that's held within those interrelations. So the first aspect is flux, and this is the ontology really of dialectics. I think it's easy to grasp, as nearly everyone would agree that change is constantly taking place in some form. One can never step into the same river twice, as Heraclitus' old saying goes. But the unique aspect, I think, for dialectics here is that this emphasis on flux really forces us, when we're doing our analysis, to include how things happen as part of what a thing or phenomena is. It's not a simple cause and effect model anymore, it's a far more historical notion of change. And it replaces the idea of a thing or a phenomena as separate and static, and it replaces that with a notion of process. So process contains the thing's history and its possible futures at the same time, and that's the thing in itself. And hence, Marx saw the historical and social relations of capitalism as the conditions of emergence for a possible move to communism. The second aspect is dialogue, or its method, sometimes logic as well. And I think this is relatively straightforward as well. For example, one of the first forms of dialectical thinking in ancient India adapted a question and answer method between the various ascetics, the so-called Veda Vedanta approach. In the Western canon, this is usually known to us through Plato's dialogues that involve the method of elenchus, so two or more people attempting to debate a specific problem until they get to a point of contradiction and hopefully resolution. And sometimes these dialogical forms can become so sophisticated that they get articulated into systems of logic. And we can see this in ancient Indian thought as well, through Nyaya logic, and also in the Gelugpa Buddhist tradition that continues today in Tibet, but even the closed system of the Christian scholastics, which I go through in the book but won't here. Now, thirdly, if there's one key part of dialectics I would emphasize in my definition, and this is also shared by Bertel Ollman, who I consider one of the leading figures in Marxist dialectics, is this philosophy of internal relations. Now, to me, it could be called otherwise something along the lines of the relations inside the whole. because internal may wrongly imply that we're looking at the individual makeup of a particular thing, when what we're in fact concerned with is the whole in which it relates. So internal relations treats the relations in which anything stands as essential parts of what that thing is. The parts of the whole are not separate from each other, but they're inherently related. So changing one part of the thing changes all the other individual units and the whole as well, and vice versa. So the upshot of this is that the identity of one thing that's abstracted or separated from everything else is not really the thing in itself. It's mere appearance. It's one-sided and ultimately false. And this is really the revolutionary aspect of dialectical thinking, because it overturns common sense views, superficiality, and makes things appear static and independent from each other, particularly liberal ideologies of today. So, I won't, in considering time, I won't go into those two examples, but suffice to say, in the Western tradition, internal relations comes through to us from Parmenides and onwards, but there's also examples that I trace in Buddhism and Taoism as well. So there's many conceptions of time and change that are depicted there. Modernists tend to follow a linear pattern conception of time, other cultures are circular. But what comes out of the dialectical notion of change is that change is seen as a spiral. There's a lot of history to this symbol that I won't go into here again for considerations of time, but perhaps this is best known linked to Engels' account, following Marx of course, that dialectics reveals that everything is made of the mutual penetration of polar opposites or contradictions, and the negation of this relation leads to gradual change, and that's what he called the spiral form of development. So change progresses within a spiral, but it's not circular, and most importantly, it's not deterministic or necessarily progressive either. And I think that's why the spiral image is so important. Okay, so finally, some of the big claims of the book. Firstly, I've found that dialectical thinking is not particular and not unique, but has emerged across a range of civilizations during the Axial Age, albeit in ways that differ in terms of what they emphasize and the content. So what was the Axial Age? It's a term developed by Karl Jaspers quite a few years ago, and he developed to explain a shift that he saw in history, what he called the axis in human consciousness that took place between 800 and 200 BC, thereabouts. And it involved three changes in human thought. Firstly, the movement from the mythos and the mundane to the transcendental or metaphysical philosophy. Secondly, there was a beginning of a recognition of historical unity, what Jaspers called solidarity across humankind, or at least across these civilizations, which was also unique. And the third was this realization of historical self-comprehension, or the idea that humans could now lead themselves and lead their own history directly. And so this was nothing less than a revolution in thought in these axial civilizations. So I have a quote on the slide there, I don't know if you can read it, but basically it's where Jaspers, where he indicates how Axial Age thinking was dialectical, how thought became its own object, how critical thinking is used to attempt to convince others, so hence the importance of rational argumentation and dialogue. There is a focus on the exploration of contradictions and opposites that remained related to each other rather than separated. And most of all, there was the questioning of all previously accepted ideas, customs, and traditions. And so in this period, people were asking what Jaspers called radical questions. There were sociological and material similarities across all these civilizations that led to this axis or shift. The formation of small city-states that were independent or at least perhaps sovereign, increases in trade, massive improvements in agriculture, and what I think was the most important factor, widespread urbanization. And this brought about a focus for spiritual questioning. So now Jaspers gives an unfortunate, I think, religious and Eurocentric flavour to all of this, which we can dismiss. And he openly says it's just a way for us to conceptualise history, of course, and order it in our minds. But all of that aside, he looks for and finds what he calls a profound common element to these axial civilizations. And I argue that this common element is that they all began to think dialectically or along dialectical lines. And they did so because dialectics was the ideal means to think through oppositions and contradictions as inherently related, that is, no longer as binary oppositions, black and white thinking or as separate, but now as correlatives, that is, things were mutually implicated in the other. And this was a massive shift in thought. And secondly, it allowed these societies to engage with these new forms of metaphysical and transcendental questions in an open format, that of rational dialogue between opposed ideas rather than through force or tradition or authority. And this was especially true in Axial Age India, as we'll soon see. Now, this doesn't mean people agreed, but it was in the absence of old accepted traditions and authorities that, the abandonment of myths or tribal kings, that each society had to now settle these metaphysical disputes through thought, and in which dialectics will become a crucial tool. So in short, Axial Age civilizations began to think dialectically because they were confronted with similar social conditions. The massive transformation from agrarian into urban centres, and they were faced with similar metaphysical concerns stemming from the old losses of legitimacy and authority. And in India that took the form of a post-Vedic system. So I make the rather big claim to Axial Age scholarship that what unifies this period is this emergence of dialectical thinking. And luckily for me, we have a lot of evidence in terms of the philosophical record that have survived across all of these communities, and which offers a lot of rich materials to go off. Okay, so after that rather long introduction, we'll get into the chapter, and apologies for anybody of you that actually read it. It was 40 pages long. And I just want to affirm before I begin that I'm trying to deal with these very respectfully, these texts. I know they're part of a spiritual belief system, but I'm treating them strictly as philosophical documents, and what I'm tracing is how they show people beginning to think dialectically. So, dialectics emerged in India in very similar fashion to other axial civilizations. There was extreme social disparities of wealth under hierarchical divisions, and there was against a period of profound technological, productive, and social growth. So after the composition of the Vedas around 1500 BCE, India in its classical or Brahmanic period, which is a timeline that fits perfectly with Jasper's Axial Age, was basically a land of profound change. It was a time when traditional practices and beliefs and the interpretation of the Vedas were reassessed. And out of this would come many schools of thought: Hindu, Buddhist, Jainist and other schools, the heterodox and orthodox darsanas, individual mystics and renouncers and so on, all locked in deep disputes over metaphysics that was of fundamental consequence, not just for religion and spirit, but social order as well. So this concern of reinterpreting the Vedas was the concern that dominated thought. So the East Ganges Basin, so east of Patna, was the actual focus of this Axial Age development. So it seems Patna has a long history of radical thought, stretching all the way back from 800 BCE to this conference this week. And the Brahmana of the 100 Paths offers a mythical reason for this, that the Gdansk River had never been, as it says, burnt over by the god Agni. And this has been interpreted as showing that it meant the orthodox Brahmin from the western Doab, or from the land of the holy sages, hadn't penetrated beyond this point. So in this place between Western Orthodoxy and an emerging heterogeneous and urban society in the East, provided the site for this intense social and intellectual dispute that would propel India's Axial Age. So what was unique was not just the overall material developments that I've already highlighted, but the fact that these new intellectuals were aware of change, and this led to radical and innovative thinking. So I won't go further into the social forces underlying this move. I'll just give a few examples of dialectical thinking in these traditions. So the texts to which dialectical thinking were first applied are some of the earliest written examples of philosophy that we have: the Rig Veda, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata. So the Rig Veda contains passages that trace cosmogonic speculation, especially in its hymns on the deities, books 1 to 10, and this examines the nature of the universe and God. And it really offers the early attempts to think through the contradictions that arise when human mind begins to speculate on the nature of cosmic origins. So as is well known, there were numerous cosmogonies and no single standard cosmogony within ancient India, nor today. And it's in this hotbed of contested ideas that provided this fertile ground for dialectics to develop. So arguably I find that one of the cosmogenic hymns expresses really clearly this type of speculation that would propel dialectics forward. And this hymn attempts to think through the meaning of the opposition of being and non-being at the point of creation. And it follows words that really echo in Hegel. That is, to think beyond the impasse between the divine auto-generation of the cosmic idea and of creation. But the key point is that it breaks off in its answer here, saying that this might never be knowable. But what is key is not just its skepticism here, but how it raises the possibility of other worlds, other dawns, other times. And it's these points that were the focus of transcendent thought during the Axial Age. The Bhagavad Gita is another text that juxtaposed good and evil and creation and destruction, both in a spiritual sense, but also for thought in thinking through oppositions. And more importantly, one of the themes that comes out of it is the delusion of binary oppositions between good and bad that it says to be one of the principal sources of error. So one of the first instances of what we call both and thinking within dialectics can be seen in this dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna, where Arjuna is stuck within thinking in either or categories, not realizing that Krishna's categories are not either or but both and. And the latter is this dialectical way, an early dialectical way of thinking, in which opposites don't exclude each other but complement each other. And this both and thinking was taken up in the Axial Age, especially evidenced in the Ishara Upanishad and its account of Brahma as being both with and without qualities. And yet, even today, many scholars sort of remain stuck in their interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita at the point of analytical contradiction. There's good work done by Dorda who shows that these contradictions that appear contradictory disappear when they're seen as arguments that are related dialectically rather than analytically. So they can't be solved or resolved by conceptual distinctions or further terminological clarifications. They actually require a change to a dialectical perspective. So one example is Krishna's statement that Brahma is neither existent nor non-existent, and it's meaningful only at a point where thought pushes through the paradox of thinking existence and being within a sensory or a phenomenal frame. Quote, if we understand existence in terms of presence in space and time, and non-existence as absence from space and time, the source of space and time itself can neither be said to exist or not exist. And it's this type of thinking that it was great examples. So how was dialectics first defined in these debates in ancient India, and how we know it can translate across time and culture? There's excellent work by Matilal that provides a range of answers to this question. So he finds the most relevant Sanskrit term seems to be Vada or Vada Vivada, which is defined as bifurcating or a divisive debate. And this is for the reason, and this is the reason that leads him to say dialectics in ancient India was the art of philosophical disputation. So he sets the scene also within the Axial Age, in which this new dialectical philosophy and this new method in particular was quote-unquote brisk, critical and controversial. And it moved into refuting the mundane and the transcendent. Another unique feature of ancient Indian dialectics was its spirit of knowledge seeking. So there's a passage from the Questions of Milinda that captures this cooperative intention eloquently. When the scholars debate with one another, it says, there is a summing up and unravelling, there is also defeat, and the scholars do not get angry at all. Consequently, Vada and Vada Vedanta were upheld as the most productive way of thinking because each involved honest seekers after truth within a formal context of honest and fair debate. So part of the utility of dialectical thinking here can also be seen in some of the law courts at the time. So Solomon shows how legal disputes involve dialectics both in the procedures of intellectual debates, but also the use of syllogistic statements and arguments. There's another text, which is a legal text on Dharma and engages in questions of law and rights and conduct. And it states that where doubt arises, so in cases where there's doubt regarding interpretation of the Dharmas, that an assembly of 10 persons was required to deliberate the matter. and this assembly expressly includes a dialectician. So this gives a lot of impetus behind dialectical thought and its importance at the time. So just moving on to a couple of the schools, there's many that I go through in the text, but I'll just highlight a few. One of the most significant challenges to orthodoxy during this time emanated from the Charvaka school, who insisted on perception, inferential doubt, and empiricism within a largely materialist conception of the cosmos. So they rejected the Vedas, the doctrines of karma and samsara, and the notion of the afterlife. And they were persecuted by the Brahmin, and we've lost much of their text, but a few fragments remain. But for them, insisting on this materialism and sense perception was really a defense against deception, okay? And they were labeled negativists largely for using this apophantic dialectical negative arguments. I'm running out of time already so I'll just give a few more examples. There was a relational form in Vaisheshika Sutra, both about the phenomenal world and the transcendent worlds, and it says we can actually have knowledge of the phenomenal truly, based around its atomistic ontology. So it was one of the first to come up with a theory of atoms and see that these were the interrelation between these was the reason for all movement and change in the world, and this really propelled again a materialist and scientific discoveries. There was also Nyaya logic, which is perhaps the best known example coming out of ancient India for dialectical thinking. I won't go into its complex logic here. I'll actually skip those two examples. But one of which, in terms of relations, is really important. And the final one that I'll talk about is from Jainism, the Jainist school. And for them, they really highlight that substances undergo endless change, but what we as humans perceive are merely single facets of this process. So judgment is therefore conditional, and it's true only in the context where the object it refers to remains the same. So to gain knowledge and experience from only one Naya, that is one individual characteristic, is for a Jainist to become like one of the 7 blind men who, each feeling separate parts of an elephant, conclude that the part they hold represents the elephant as a whole. And so from this parable, they come up with a whole entire system of logic to ensure through 15 questions that all sides and perspectives of something has been explored. Okay. So there are a couple of critiques that I launch in terms of the limits of this approach in dialectics. Stated simply, the questions dialectics was made to serve in the Axial Age were largely parasitic on the Vedic cosmology. Okay, so it was really bound to a set of metaphysical concerns. And this led to a sort of paradox because it gave dialectics motivation to strive into unknowns and yet stunted its wider development and application. So quite simply, dialectics was not being made to ask critical social questions that would have been more important for a Marxist, for example. And the second one goes into the limits of its application or thinking through internal relations. I won't go into that one. So, what are the benefits, I think, of this type of research? Firstly, I think it's crucial because we can retrieve this lost history and come to a better understanding of how different cultures conceptualize change, because many of these continue to influence philosophical thought today. The second reason is that it decenters thinking in the West and brings an awareness to older and different forms of dialectical thought that might be of importance for social struggle today. And the third reason is really for further research into why dialectics made great strides in each of these civilizations, in each of these periods, but then retreated or collapsed altogether. And this is the common finding that I see across all of these chapters in this book, and it's a great historical mystery for me. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we do have time for questions, so please.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. There is a certain strain of post-colonial thought that has tended to argue that universal concepts, or the concept of universalism itself, is a Eurocentric West European construct that's alien to the non-European world, the concept of universals and universalism. Of course, many post-colonial thinkers deny this, like Fanon, who said that the anti-colonial struggle, as he put it, is an untidy affirmation of an original idea propounded as an absolute. But there still is a tendency in post-colonial theory today to view any affirmation of universalism as a reflection of the narrowness of Western rationalism. In your research, do you find evidence that would counter that claim?
Any more? Yes, please.
So in the Southern Hemisphere and in the African context, one of the main dialectics is between male and female gender relations, where complementarity is a major social foundation. So I just wonder, what did you find in terms of the relations of male and female?
Okay, are there any more questions? Any more questions? Yeah, at the back. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm speaking in defense of Eurocentrism, if you want to put it that way, in the sense that Hegel and Marx are self-consciously talking about societies that must change in order to reproduce themselves. And they are aware that that history is thinking through them, that historicity of their society is thinking through them. So the issue of dialectics there is one of consciousness of historical change. I don't see how a dialectic that's conscious of itself as historical could exist in societies that are, so to speak, predicated on the reproduction of themselves as they are, which is, of course, not actually true of non-Western societies. It's true of all societies before modernity.
Okay, there's one question over there, and yeah.
My question is only tangential to your presentation. You had stated, my question is the following. What is the object of study of dialectics? If you understand subjective dialectics, what is the object of study? The reason I'm asking this is, if I define historical materialism as a study of social formations, then how would you talk about the relationship between dialectics and historical materialism?
Sorry, can you say that last part again?
How would you want to define the relationship between dialectics and historical materialism?
Okay, then I think you have about 3 minutes to respond
okay.
to all of that.
Yep. So universalism. Not in the sense of an overarching ethical project, but there's definitely concepts of universalism working within ancient Indian dialectics and pretty much all of these, but it's usually a universalism about monism or non-dualism, yeah? So the world is one, this transcendent realm is one with it, how do we know it? So it's a universalism in which everything is part, everything is related, Brahman Atman, yeah? So it is universal, but it's not, it doesn't lead to an ethical program of universalism that we would understand, I guess, in Western philosophy in sort of Kantian terms, that this is going to apply to all. But there's definitely, universalism is the key part of this axial breakthrough, because they start thinking rather than in particular terms, particular people, that there's a whole. And they usually emphasize it in terms of metaphysics and giving predominance to the transcendental rather than the mundane. But I think it's definitely universalism, but not in an ethical, political project. Gender relations, yeah, very interesting question. There's not much, unfortunately, that I could find in the historical record to answer that. There was definite signs that females and Sudras as well were also part of early debates in the Axial Age, but later, like with the Charvaka school, these texts or these certain ways of thinking that emerged during this axial period sort of get lost, and there's when there's that closing of the Axial Age under a sort of new authority of the Brahman and that sort of idea. So there were examples, and I think the Charvaka school is the most interesting side of that, if we could only know more. Yes, so yeah, great question. Hegel, yeah, so the Axial Age is about a consciousness of change and directing change. So and a lot of what Karl Jaspers and Axial Age thinkers are getting to is that this is not a modern phenomena, this idea of directing change and being able to be, producers of your own history. It's to show that there's actually been many of these instances in the past, and yes, they do get rolled back in many instances, but there was a lot of movements forward and ideas forward, and actual change in institutions and social roles for at least a time. So they were consciously changing community. Probably not in the same terminology, but definitely I think the same impetus is there. And so the link between dialectics and historical materialism, the dialectical materialism is a very poor form of dialectical thinking in my view, yeah? It stunted all of this and it became a deterministic, closed mechanism. So the link between dialectics and dialectical materialism, I would have to ask what you mean by historical materialism, which side of the fence that you're on. But in terms of diamat, as it's known, early 1920s sort of thinking, was really, I think, detrimental to Marxian-inspired thought and thinking dialectically, through thinking open-ended processes. It closed it down into this base superstructure model, and communism is going to be inevitable, which even Marx would dispute because he took an active posture to history. It was never, going to just eventuate. So anyway, we can talk about that one later on.
Okay. Thank you. That was a really stimulating talk and stimulating discussion, and that brings the session to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the memento to our speaker? And our chairperson.